So good afternoon. My name is Paul Shadle. I'm a partner in DLA Piper's real estate practice here in Chicago. I want to thank all of you again for being here. We relish the opportunity that we have at the summits to bring such a great group of friends and clients and others together. And I hope you've enjoyed the discussions that we've had so far, that we had this morning. I'm particularly pleased as a Chicagoan to have so many people from elsewhere visiting Chicago at one of the nicest times of the year. You really got a beautiful day today. We've had a good morning full of interesting and substantive discussions, and it's clear to me that our industry is really operating in a time of change, of disruption, and maybe most important and relevant for today's conversations, in a time of ever more rapid connections between innovation and real estate. I want to draw your attentions before our panel starts to the afternoon sessions. We're doing something new this year that we haven't done before, following the concurrent sessions, with the addition of our Real Estate Live Talks, in which single presenters will speak in a brief and focused way about topics that we hope will lead to some rich discussions. In particular, Phil Williams will speak about wellness and its connection to places that we develop and operate and in which we all work and live. Mark Joseph will address the future of mobility and its connection to the built environment. And Terry Howerton will consider more broadly the inevitability of innovation and strategies and tactics for businesses contending with it. But my goal now is to move us along so that we can hear from our distinguished panel. We have an excellent group, a collection of citizens who have worked at the highest levels in business, government, and education. And those of you who have paid attention to the world over the past few years are well aware of their experience and accomplishments, so I'm just going to give you some brief highlights for each. Our moderator is Carol Melton. Carol is the CEO and founder of Adept Capital, a venture capital firm based in Washington investing in early-stage companies and other international business interests, which she founded after spending many years in top management at two global media companies. First at the combined Viacom and CBS, where she managed domestic and international government affairs and had responsibilities ranging across Paramount, MTV, Showtime, and CBS. And then at Time Warner, where she was in top management as the EVP for Global Public Policy when AT&T acquired the company. She's on a number of boards and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Secretary William Cohen is the chairman and CEO of the Cohen Group, as mentioned earlier, a global consulting firm with which we at DLA Piper are privileged to have a relationship, an exclusive relationship. He has a reputation across the globe for integrity, bipartisanship, and accomplishment. He became a leader as soon as he arrived in Congress. As a member from Maine, and in the U.S. Senate, he was appointed to a number of powerful subcommittees, including Government Affairs Oversight Subcommittee. He was a member of the Select Committee on Intelligence for a decade, serving half that time as chairman. He served as Secretary of Defense under President Clinton, and for the younger people in the room, that marked the first time in modern U.S. history that a president chose an elected official from the other party to be a member of his cabinet. He's also on a number of boards, and as was mentioned earlier, writes fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, a busy person. Bob Corker is a successful businessman and a former United States Senator from Tennessee. He represented Tennesseans in the U.S. Senate from 2007 to 2018, where he served as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and was an active member of the Senate Banking Committee and Senate Budget Committee. Before that, he was Tennessee's Commissioner of Finance, the mayor of Chattanooga, but he spent most of his life in business, and in particular in the real estate business. He founded his own construction company when he was 25 and eventually operated in 18 states, and he later purchased two old real estate holding companies in Chattanooga, and he remains actively involved in the real estate business, I believe. Ambassador Nicholas Burns is the Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm going to give you just a few highlights from his career, which is long and varied. He's a senior counselor to the Cohen Group. He's executive director of the Aspen Strategy Group and Aspen Security Forum. He served in the U.S. government as a career Foreign Service officer under both parties, as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. He was U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2001 through 2005. He was our ambassador in Greece, and he worked on the National Security Council as the senior director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia affairs, and also served as a special assistant to President Clinton. I will stop there. And I would like all of you to give a very warm welcome to our panel.
Thank you.
turn it over to Carol. Carol.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. And it's a pleasure to be with you here today, and particularly with this distinguished panel that we have. As I was thinking about sort of teeing this up with this group who has had such an extraordinary careers of service, one of the things that I think really strikes me about the three of you is that you are people of action, and you're people who have served this country admirably, as well as people who want to actually get something done. And so I think that'll be part of the context of this, of people who were in government when things happened and the things that you achieved, that now we're seeing some of the changes that maybe have occurred since the time that you spent in government and where we find ourselves today. So we will save time for questions. We'll have a conversation here for maybe about half an hour. I think we're to end at 2. So we will try to, around 1:30, stop so that we can have all of you join the conversation with us. So we had done some notes earlier working with folks, and everything went out the window this morning because, as happens in these current times, that today in New York, we all know this is UN General Assembly week. The President of the United States spoke this morning, and there have been lots of things already happening today. So we will get right to it. And Ambassador Burns, and I had asked, I've gotten approval for this in advance, rather than using these monikers, it's sort of hard to figure out which ones to go to. We're gonna go by some first names here. So we'll start, and anyone who wants to, maybe Bill, you might jump in here, or Bob, talk about some of the things that happened this morning, and anybody take it away of some of the announcements that came out. While you have all been focused on real estate, some things are happening that will have implications, and we should talk about how all of this fits in from a bigger picture before we deep dive into some of the specifics. So take it away. These are the good guys of government.
All right. So, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to be very brief. I think one of the most significant things that happened this morning, and the four of us talked about it, was the announcement, the joint statement by Chancellor Merkel and President Macron and Prime Minister Boris Johnson on Iran, which said publicly that they were very concerned about Iran's attack on the Saudi oil facilities a week ago Saturday. And they were showing a lot of solidarity with President Trump and the United States. That was a good thing. Number two, that it now appears that the Europeans are at least open to broadening our negotiations with Iran from solely a preoccupation on their nuclear weapons future. We want to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons power, to including in that what Iran's doing on ballistic missiles, on human rights, and especially, as we talked about last night for those who were at dinner, Iran's dangerous activities in destabilizing Yemen and Syria and Iraq and Lebanon and Gaza. Iran is the biggest troublemaker in the Gulf, and for the first time in 45 years, there's a country that is trying to disrupt the flow of oil and gas out of the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. It's the job partly of the United States to keep the Gulf open. So if in fact this dead nuclear deal from President Obama, the one that President Trump pulled out, if now we can renegotiate it and have a look at extending the timelines where Iran could not produce fissile material or even consider any other nuclear activity, if you combine restrictions on Iran's ballistic missiles and Iran's activity in the region, put it all into a negotiation, the Iranians will hate this. But it might be the best thing for the United States to see this agreement renegotiated. I think that was the most significant thing that happened this morning. It might be an opening for the president and his successor to try to further constrain Iran, and we should try to contain and constrain Iran.
Bob, I know you have a lot of experience here, if you'll
I think what's ironic about what's happened today is that all of those things were things that we knew the president cared about when he ran for election. And so right after being elected, we began working with the other side of the aisle to craft legislation to deal with all of these issues that were just brought up. And we put the onus on the administration to negotiate with Germany, the UK, and France. And the issue that really kept us from moving ahead with changing the agreement to some degree was Angela Merkel's resistance to doing away with the sunset provision. One of the greatest flaws for those of you like me who did not support the agreement was that it ended in 10 years. We were already into it for a couple of years, and so they were off and running from my perspective after 10 years and able to still do the research and development on the IR2s, the IR4s, the IR6s, and the IR8s, which really gave them momentum when this period ended. And so it's ironic that now, after all of this, in essence, the Europeans have come around, it seems, to the position that we were all at the beginning of the administration and where the president was.
And Bill,
Yeah,
I'm sure you have more to add on this and from a big picture perspective in the history that you have.
Well, first, let me say what a pleasure it is to have Senator Corker join us, along with Ambassador Burns. I do regret that the junior senator from Maine, Senator Mitchell, is not with us this year. Obviously, I pummeled him so badly in the last round that he decided he couldn't take any more punishment and decided to stay away.
Yeah.
But we've always enjoyed having this opportunity to throw things back and forth at each other. With respect to Iran, I think it was very clear from all of the folks that I talked to that the intelligence was rather overwhelming. They identified exactly where the attack on the Saudi oil fields emanated from, and it was on Iranian territory. That made a difference because you had the issue being raised was an attack from Yemen, or who launched the attack, the Houthis or the Iranians. I don't think it made any difference. Iran, no doubt, provided the capability in any event. But that was really important to then present that to our allies. Because frankly, the allies have called us into question, called the president's actions and words into question. And that's a very dangerous thing for us. When your allies don't believe you or don't trust the information, then obviously they're going to be reluctant to line up with you. The fact that they have done so at this point is very good news for us. My biggest complaint with the president is that he uses bombastic language. And then when it comes time, you think that bombs are going to fall, they don't. I don't like the use of threatening language to other countries unless you're prepared to back it up. And so I was concerned when he said we're locked and loaded. Again, giving the implication we're going to go to war and then backing away from it. I think that kind of on again, off again creates great anxiety on the part of our allies, not sure that they want to be with us. I think it was conservative Max Boot who said, we have this strange situation where our enemies don't fear us and our allies don't trust us. That's a dangerous position for the United States to be in. So I like to have clarity and consistency and a strategy before you even suggest you're about to use military power. But the good news coming out of this morning's statement on the part of the President for the UN, that's good for the United States. And to the extent that we hold our allies with us, that makes a big difference. I've been dealing with this issue publicly where many of the commentators, the talking heads, have said we shouldn't shed a single ounce of blood, American blood, for Saudi oil. Well, that really isn't the issue. What happens with Saudi oil doesn't just affect us, it affects the global economy. And we like to think we have this security. We are now the biggest producers of energy. And therefore, we don't need Middle Eastern oil. And therefore, we shouldn't be involved in these external affairs under any circumstances. And let the Gulf states fend for themselves. Let the Saudis fend for themselves. Let the UAE fend for itself, etc. If we take that position, that unless it directly affects us, we're not interested, then I think we're going to be in a world of hurt. Because what happens in Saudi Arabia, if Saudi Arabia were to shut down all of its oil, obviously that would have an impact globally. It would impact China, it would impact Japan, it would impact South Korea. You go down the line of the countries that will be impacted, and plus it would cause a global recession, if not depression. So I'd like to get back to the mindset that says We have to be engaged. We can't simply measure, does this immediately affect us or not? Because we still have a global role to play, which gets into what Ambassador Burns was talking about last night, that we have to approach things on a comprehensive base, strategically, to see how the world is turning. What is the role of the United States going to be? Are we pulling back, as some of the neo-isolationists would have it? Disengage from foreign entanglements? Let other countries take the responsibility? That's one option. And it may be that it's what President Trump wants to do. But I would suggest if we follow that philosophy that we're going to find ourselves not the world's policeman, but a prisoner of world events. And that's not something that I think we want to see happen. I'll stop there. That's a senatorial answer coming on. So yield the balance.
Well, you've certainly done a great job of setting the stage, as it were, talking about big picture and implications. And the other thing from this morning, for those of you who were in the room here and not able to see the president's speech, all the things that you've just said, he doubled down on the things that you have expressed concern about. He doubled down on Iran and the military might of the United States. He went double-barreled at Iran and China, and we'll get to China in a minute as well. But one of the things that came through loud and clear in this speech was that he will look at everything as per what is good for the country, is good for the United States, is how he will look at issues that come before him and said to the rest of the world, and you ought to do the same. So I think that is, again, the context in which you have given us a good assessment of where you see the world these days. So we were interested with the survey that was done, that all of you filled out on the state of the market, with a perspective really that you weren't very concerned about Brexit and the Middle East and some of the issues that we'll be talking about today, which is interesting, and as to how it affects real estate. And Senator, you're certainly right in the heart of this. You want to give some thoughts on the implications of some of these things as we tie it back to investment and the economy and real estate itself?
Well, sure. I mean,
you're thinking about
what I think we've constantly known is that business thrives when there is stability and people know what to expect. And we live in a world today where tremendous instability, have significant change, realignments, and in essence, we're playing a little bit of a role in that ourselves as far as helping spur some of that on. So it is a tough time for people who do global business to do so in a manner of having some sense of what is to come. I mean, the polarity that exists in these countries where nationalism is so rampant. And in speaking about, the president, obviously every leader of every country should do what is best for their country. But I guess trying to figure out what that is also matters. And to me, having allies that are strong and with us is good for our country. Mm-hmm. Trying to break them apart and make them weaker is not necessarily good for our country. And so I would hope every leader, again, would lead for the best interests of their nation. I think for the longer view, us keeping our friends close to us, an alliance is good for our nation, and we certainly have not done the best job of that in the last couple of years.
Nick, you spoke last evening about China, and I know you and your wife were recently there, and that, as I referenced, was part of the double barrel that was unloaded this morning was on, we've talked about Iran, but it's China is the other key component of where we see the world going. And you made the point about China's returning to power. And I think that it was really interesting to think about China's place in the world vis-a-vis the United States. And if you would talk about that a bit more.
Well, we haven't had a peer, the United States, since the implosion of the Soviet Union in December 1991. We've been the preeminent global power, but if you look at power matrices, economic strength, military power, political influence, Chinese are not up with the United States. We're still, I think, by far the most powerful country. They're getting closer. And given their size and scale, given the ambitions, and frankly, the effectiveness of their government, they're going to be a power to contend with for the rest of our lifetimes and for our kids' lifetimes. So we're going to have to compete with them. Last night we talked about the fact we're competing on the trade front for economic supremacy. We're competing in the realm of ideas. Their vision, Xi Jinping's vision, is that authoritarianism is the best political system. We profoundly disagree. We need to compete there. They want to supplant us as the strongest military power in the Indo-Pacific, and they want to beat us to the next wave of military technology produced by AI, quantum mathematics, biotechnology. We got to compete. I think we have swung both of our political parties from a 40-year policy of engaging China and competing almost entirely to competition on those 4 realms. We have to compete, but if we're talking about stabilizing the global economy, we're the number 1 and 2 economies. If we're talking about doing anything about climate change, which we should, we're the 1st and 2nd carbon emitters. And so I think somehow we're out of balance. We're almost too competitive. It's important for us to remember China's not our enemy. It's an adversary. It's a rival, but not an enemy. And there's a real distinction in those words. And so I don't think any of our presidents recently have really got the balance right. I'd say it probably should be 70%. Maybe in some weeks or months, 80% competition. But we have to reserve some place where we work productively with China because we're so symbiotically tied. That issue is going to dominate American foreign policy for the next several decades.
No question.
I don't think you can look at it just U.S. versus China. China is much bigger, 1.3 billion people against the United States. The center of gravity is now shifting to the Asia or Indo-Pacific region. Many of our allies live next to China, and they are now being forced to choose. They don't want to choose. And so we can't look at it just as a U.S.-China kind of dynamic. We have to look at who are our friends and our allies. And here again, I come back to the first thing that happened after President Trump got elected. I was in Beijing the day after the election, and I had lunch with a very high-ranking Chinese official. And he turned to me, just the 2 of us, and he said, now that President Trump is elected, does that mean that TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is dead? And I said, regrettably, yes. And he turned over and he went, good. Good. And so we gave away something that would be adverse to their interests. And then following that up, we had a number of the ASEAN countries come to the United States to the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS, and they got on a podium like this, and they said, we wasted 7 years negotiating with you on this TPP. Not only waste 7 years, but you undercut our credibility with our own constituents. So they were angry. Now, that's not a way to begin to take on China in terms of building relationships with countries who share our ideals and our interests in helping to not contain China. It's too big to be contained, but certainly to try to influence its activities and its goals in a way that is more balanced. We should be joining with the EU in terms of dealing with China. They have the same problems that we do, in terms of intellectual property, in terms of forced transfer of technology when they go to China. We have a lot of common interests, and yet I think we are determined to see this as the U.S. versus China. And I agree with Nick very much. Don't turn China into an enemy. They're a competitor. They're an adversary on some issues, but if we turn them into an enemy, then we risk losing many of our own allies in the region who will then be forced to choose which side do they want to be on and where are they closest to, and that's not good for us.
Bob, do you want to give us some thoughts maybe on where we think this trade war may be taking us? The president, again, this morning in his speech, made the comment of how much the trade war is costing China. And of course, the fact checkers went back again afterwards and pointed out, well, it isn't accurate to say it's affecting China, it's affecting what American consumers are paying. Where do you think this is where is this taking us? And any predictions on where we're going to go on this? Will there be an agreement?
I have no idea. It's I led on the Senate floor. I led the charge to try to take back the authorities that Congress should not have given the president back in 1974 with the 1974 Trade Act, where we in essence gave the president the ability with a national security waiver to do everything that he's doing right now, where we, under national security waiver, have problems now with Canada and Mexico, our two friendly neighbors, the European Union. And so I know that most Republicans in Congress do not like what's happening. I know some Democrats have issues because steel and those kinds of things, the unions are constituents of theirs. So we never were able to come together to keep what is happening from happening. I think it's very destructive. I read a great paper yesterday. It's turned into a book. Somebody wants me to write a little thing on the front end of it, so I read it coming over here. And to see the data on how it's affecting our country is just remarkable. And I wish that everybody in this room, and certainly everybody in the House and Senate, will read this and see the impacts, because the trade flows are changing and they're likely not to come back. And I agree that we don't want China to be an enemy. They are an adversary, but we also want to manage that well and continue to do business with them. So I think we're doing things today, even if it turns out well. Let's say over the next 6 months, somehow or another, we come to a conclusion. Hopefully that conclusion will deal with the intellectual property theft and the fact that they force our companies to do partnerships with Chinese companies. If we do all this and don't end with something like that, this obviously will be for naught. But what does concern me is those longer term issues of those trade flows changing permanently and permanently damaging our ability to access the 1.3 billion people that we'd like to do business with.
I think the president was correct in challenging China. China has been tilting the playing field for the past, certainly the last 2 decades, in their favor. So the president was correct to call them out and challenge them. My complaint is the way it's been gone about, namely unilaterally, without dealing with our allies to help beef up our own capability and challenge them. Because China against the United States, they've got a system whereby it's top-down driven. They don't have any of the obstacles that we have to navigate in dealing with issues. And so the Chinese, they have a vision. They know where they want to go, and they know how to get there, and they just tell everybody to get out of the way. And so that allows them to do things much faster than we can in a democracy. So taking that into account, we don't want to replicate that. We want to offer the rest of the world a better way of achieving the same goals that the Chinese have in mind. And if I had to bet, I would bet that the Chinese are eager, as the president, I think, is eager to make a deal before the next election. I don't think it'll deal with the substance, the real hard substance of the conflict or competition that we have. But I think the president wants to be in a position going to next year. I made a deal. I took on the Chinese. I made a deal with the Chinese. I'm taking on the North Koreans. We're going to make a deal with the North Koreans. And by the way, I think I'm going to make a deal with the Iranians to lock up 3 agreements like that. Even though they may not deal ultimately with the real substantive issues, I think it puts him in a pretty strong position going to the election. So I might disagree with the way he does things and what he says in pursuing his policies, but I think that he will point with some success to some trade issues coming up.
Can I join the chorus and just say
Absolutely.
that I support what Secretary Cohen and the Senator have said? The president's been right to tackle the issue that China is a massive violator of its World Trade Organization commitments, specifically against kind of the lifeblood of the American economy in this century, which is our intellectual property, at the heart of most companies. But the tactics haven't worked, because at the same time we've been sanctioning China, we've been sanctioning Mexico, Canada, the EU, Japan, and South Korea. And a room full of lawyers and real estate negotiators here, you all understand the principles that apply in your job apply in ours. You've got to have leverage. And we have this unique advantage over China and Russia. We have allies in the military and trade realms. And if we had taken Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was it was actually originally President George W. Bush's idea, that President Obama picked up and actualized. That's 40% of global GDP, which we could have deployed against China. If you add the European Union to it, just as a negotiating partner, you had 60% of global GDP against China. That's leverage, and the president doesn't have leverage on his side.
And I'm sure there may be a little bit more that we talk about China, but in the time we have left, let's also move to Europe as well, where we also have significant activities going on. We have Boris Johnson day after day in the same way. We have pronouncements coming out of the US. We certainly have things coming out, interestingly, from the UK. And of course, yesterday there was a decision that Boris Johnson's decision to disband Parliament for weeks was found to be unconstitutional. Doesn't really mean a whole lot, but politically there's a lot going on in Europe and between Europe and the UK. So let's take a moment to talk about, if we want to talk about Brexit, we've got the transition from Angela Merkel, who has been a stabilizing force, a leader there. We've got certainly the yellow vests, the yellow jackets, the turmoil that we're seeing with Macron in France. Give us some thoughts on that as well, as to how that impacts this global economy that is, while strong, is also seems somewhat fragile given everything that's going on and the tensions in the world.
First of all, Boris Johnson's one of the most entertaining people to meet with.
Great. That zip cord thing, I still remember that.
Is quite entertaining. I think the lesson with Brexit is when you have a tough issue to deal with, you don't punt it to a referendum. Right. One of the most strategic errors that has been made, and certainly the UK is paying a big price, as will the rest of the West. And hopefully this will be resolved in some manner. Look, we're going through tremendous transformation right now, and what happened in our country in the last election is happening in Europe. It's happening in numbers of other places. It just happened in Brazil. And this polarization, what you're watching on the television, by the way, since I left the Senate 9 months ago, I have not seen 1 second of cable television. It's been most refreshing. But what you see happening here is happening in other places. And we saw today, I was fascinated. I've been out of real estate for 12 years. I'm moving back in, doing some private equity. But you look at the changes that, for me, looking today at this presentation, which was most useful, and thank you for letting me be here, to see the data and the way you're managing your companies, and very quickly I've got to learn to do the same, it's remarkable. Think about the way things would have been 12 years ago. Nothing like this. Well, we're dealing with democracies that just are slow. I mean, we have to have votes and we have to pass bills, and the world is changing in every other area just as rapidly as what you saw today in real estate. And so it's difficult. And then you have the social media component that's not only here but in these other places where people are traveling on non-fact and debating non-fact heavily. And so it's challenging all democracies. And I worry about democracies for that reason. China obviously believes that their model is much better than ours because they can make a decision and move on. We have to hash it out. And so what you're seeing happening in Europe is the same thing that's happening here, which means we need to work even more closely together as we're challenged by these dynamic things that are happening in our countries.
Well, Tom Friedman wrote a book years ago saying that the world is flat. And he was talking about how technology has flattened the world so that we can compete, we can collaborate, we can cooperate with other countries on an equal basis. That has changed much of the world for the better. But it also has generated these kinds of challenges to the United States dominance for the past 70, 80 years. Part of the problem is that if I look at Vladimir Putin's bucket list, I would say, first, let's get Brexit passed. Second, let's sow dissension in the EU. Third, let's sow dissension in the United States. Fourth, let's undercut the reliability of the traditional media. You go down the list, and basically we've done all of those things. So where Putin has had a bucket list to break up the power centers around the globe, he is being successful, and we have been doing the same. President Trump said, he went over and said Brexit is good for the British. I don't know why he came to that conclusion, but he did. Secondly, he's attacked the EU, saying it really has been organized in a way to defeat the United States. Third, he has questioned the use, the vitality of NATO, saying it wasn't measuring up to its responsibilities. You go down the list of issues, and we have contributed to this notion of instability. To me, what has really a fundamental issue is globalization, immigration, and global climate change. Those three factors have contributed to this lack of continuity, consistency, and instability in the world today. With globalization, there have been winners and losers. We like to point to all the winners, we've forgotten about the losers. President Trump was able to tap into the losers, saying, you people, us, are the elitists. We're the ones who are in charge, creating these issues, trade agreements and such that left out the people who really count, the left behinds. And so you've had the globalization issue, you've had the immigration issue, both on our southern border, but also look what happened with Syrian refugees. We had a NATO commander who said that Putin had weaponized the refugees, deliberately bombing those areas in Syria, driving the refugees up into Europe so Europe could be destabilized. That has been successful as well. So you've got immigration trends on our border, also in Europe. Also with the weather changing radically, you're going to have more and more migration from places where there is no water to places where it's overwhelmed with water. But you're going to see migration flows which will contribute to this. So ultimately, we can't solve these global issues unless we act on a global basis. There's no country powerful enough to deal with any of these issues alone. So this speaks to what Senator Corker was just saying. We've got to have friends and allies who share our interests and ways of doing business. We can yield to the Chinese model, or to the Russian model, or to the Turkish model. But I don't think that's what the American people want. I think that the American people still want to have this openness, freedom, democracy, yes, debate. We may go slower, but ultimately we'll go higher.
Carol, I'd say that, at least in my view, and I agree with Senator Corker and Secretary Cohen, this is the area where President Trump has done the most damage to American national interests. Because let's remember the importance of Europe. Long-term power is shifting towards the Indo-Pacific, but our leading trade partner right now is the European Union, the 28 countries of the EU. The leading investor of capital into our economy, the 28 countries of the EU. The greatest number of American allies in the world, Canada and the 27 European allies in NATO. They really matter to us. And in a way, our relationship with Europe is the power differential between the US and Russia. Russia has 0 allies. We've got all these allies in Europe. What's the president done? At best, he's been highly ambivalent towards NATO. But in reality, he's not leading NATO. He's the first American president in the history of NATO, 70 years, who doesn't believe in it and who failed to even reaffirm Article 5 on his first 2 visits to NATO headquarters. As the secretary said, we actually demanded the creation of what became the European Union. We tied Marshall Aid Plan in the 40s and 50s, Truman and Eisenhower, to the creation of the coal and steel community and the Treaty of Rome, which eventually became the European Union. Yes, we compete with the EU on trade, but boy, do we need the EU on 1,000 other issues. The president has been giving a lot of support to the anti-democratic populists in Europe, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, the government of Poland, Matteo Salvini in Italy. And who's the president been denigrating constantly? Our closest friend, Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, Theresa May when she was in office, Justin Trudeau, another NATO leader. So it's as if we're living in this upside-down Alice in Wonderland world when suddenly the people we embrace are the authoritarians and the people we try to defeat politically are the democratic leaders. Last point. I was a brand new ambassador at NATO on September 11, 2001. I've been there 12 days. Within 3 hours of the attacks, the European allies in Canada had come to my mission in Brussels, a joint State Department military mission. We want to invoke Article 5 of a NATO treaty, which had never been invoked. An attack on one of us shall be considered an attack on all of us. By the evening of September 11th, they were all with us. The next morning, we invoked Article 5. All those Europeans and Canadians went into Afghanistan with us. They're still there 18 years later with our troops. They've suffered over 1,000 combat deaths. You can't buy that kind of loyalty in the world today. The Russians and Chinese have nothing like it. We do. And so if you drive them away, and the president is actively trying to drive them away, you weaken the United States. I don't think Senator Corker, much better witness than I would on this issue, but what I detect when I testify before the House and Senate, strong support in the Senate and House for NATO. Strong support for our relationship with the EU. So I think the silver lining might be, I don't see many political leaders in Congress who would want to adopt President Trump's attitude.
And you might add, that's the only time Article 5 has ever been utilized, and that was on our behalf. I know firsthand that the president believes that the European Union was created to undermine the United States and to compete with us. And so when you go into it with that mindset, I think that he derives some pleasure from the fact that our friends are going through the troubles they're having, and prompts it from time to time.
Yeah.
Well, I promised we would open this up to some questions. Thank you for that. And we have stayed with an international focus for this part of the conversation. I have no doubt, and it saved that opportunity for those of you here who may want to broach some of the domestic topics that we will see with the upcoming election next year and other aspects of that. So with that, we will see if anyone in the audience would like to take a crack at our experts here and see what they will say. Here we go. One here.
Mike's coming.
Hi there. I'm just curious. You know, Russia is an economic pipsqueak on the world stage. They're sort of a small gas station on the world highway. Why do we give them so much credence at the adult table, if you will, still?
So Russia has the GDP, I think, of Spain, and you're right about that. And it's a declining economy. The demographics are bad. The health statistics are bad. The life expectancy. But they've got a guy named Vladimir Putin leading them. He's 20 years in power. He's very skillful and opportunistic. They have nuclear weapons. They've got a strategic position in Syria. So we have to deal with them. But I think, you know, American policy under President George W. Bush and President Obama, and now under President Trump, I guess, is to contain them. And that's the right thing to do, contain Russian power in Eastern Europe so they can't do to other countries what they've done to Ukraine. But obviously the larger issue for us is going to be competing with China. China's far more consequential than Russia.
Yeah, and I think what's happened, you take what happened in Georgia in 2008, what happened in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and then what happened in Syria. They stepped into vacuums that put themselves at the table, honestly, and we're dealing with that now.
And they have the capacity to attack the United States digitally, cyber.
Yeah.
And they did launch a direct attack upon the integrity of this country. It was an act of war, as such, carried out at the digital level. It's one in which the president refuses to attach responsibility to the Russians for some inexplicable reason. Notwithstanding the unanimous opinion of the intelligence community that the Russians attacked us, the president publicly said, President Putin said he didn't do it. I believe him. I don't believe my intelligence community. That's a very sad thing to have happened. I think it was one of the most, I think, consequential statements ever made at the presidential level, that you believe a denial by President Putin when your entire intelligence community said, no, he did attack us. So that's contributing. I think you say, why bother with, why treat them as anything more than a gas station on the highway? It's because they have the capacity to inflict real damage, causing confusion between what is true and what is false, and taking us into the world of George Orwell's 1984. where if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. 2 + 2 = 5 or 6. That's the danger that Russia poses to us, as do the Chinese and others, but principally the Russians.
Do you have other questions here? There we go, right here.
Thank you all for being here. It's been really interesting. There are dozens, probably, of lawsuits and investigations of Trump, his businesses, and his family. Do you think anything's going to come of it before the election?
I'll let one of our professionals.
We're going to defer to you.
I have no idea. You know, I served in the Senate with 3 presidents, and the last 2 years with our current president. And every place that you went, the whole Capitol changed from having print reporters up there to now it's television. It's like reality TV. And every meeting you go to, every committee meeting, they know exactly where you're going to be. And this is the constant question of the day: is what's the current? You just get to where you're nothing but a commentator almost when you're serving there, answering these types of questions. I don't know. I don't know the answer. This most recent thing relative to Ukraine is obviously highly improper. Whether a transcript or a recording, I know we talked earlier, and apparently there aren't presidential recordings anymore. There used to be until the time of Nixon. So I don't know if we'll ever know fully what has happened, and your guess is as good as mine. It doesn't look to me like at the end of the day they will amount to anything before the election, but we'll see.
I think the answer is doubtful, and I don't say that with any enthusiasm. My training has been one in the law, and I believe that any public servant who takes the oath of office has a very high degree of loyalty to the Constitution. And what I have seen taking place for the past 2.5 years, maybe longer, but especially for the past 2.5 years, has been an exhibition of contempt for the rule of law. One of our principal justices, Benjamin Cardozo, he said that basically we need something higher. A public servant is a trustee, a fiduciary. And as a fiduciary, you owe to the people that you are serving as trustee a duty higher than the morals of the marketplace. Higher than the morals of the marketplace. You owe a level of integrity that is far above that. And so I look at it from a principle point of view of the rule of law, which I see being violated, diminished, ignored, and it breeds, as another justice said, if government officials start breaking the law, it breeds contempt for the rule of law. And I think that's what's happened from my perspective, because I feel this so strongly that unless we adhere to the rules that govern you and really attach our absolute loyalty to that, then I think we're in a world where the rule of law won't count anymore. And so we'll be regarded as no better than the countries that we point our fingers at. And so I expect a higher standard than what we're seeing. So I look at it from a legal point of view, and I would say there's been an absolute breach of the law, for which I think the president should be held accountable. Do I think it will take place? In all probability, no. Because on the one hand, I think the president governs out of fear, and either the members of Congress are acting out of fear or they're acting out of complicity. But I think a failure to hold a person accountable to the rule of law means that we're no longer going to be a country where the rule of law prevails. And that ultimately will affect us commercially in terms of investing in this country going forward. So I don't think the Congress has the backbone to stand up to violations of the law. I think they're fearful that they would be defeated in the next election. That's something that I worry about, think about, and saying, even if you don't bring impeachment proceedings, bring a proceeding that says these things, these 10 things, including whether you've called up Ukraine and said, by the way, I want you to check out Biden's son. By the way, I'm withholding $350 million unless you do that. By the way, I've got my emissary coming over, Rudy Giuliani. I think when those things are accepted as being okay, and when it's okay to invite the Russians into our system, it's okay to invite other countries to do the same thing the Russian did, I worry that we are no longer the country we once were.
If I can just add, I served from the Carter administration forward, and you think about the distinguished people that we have all worked with, Colin Powell and George H.W. Bush, I mean, people with unimpeachable integrity. You really have to worry about corruption. I do in the White House these days. When we take an oath of office, it's to the Constitution. It's not to the sovereign. In other countries, people take an oath of office to the sovereign. We don't. We live in a rule of law society, and I just think looking at this whole Ukraine business, and I have to be transparent, I'm supporting Vice President Biden, so you all should know that. It was highly improper, I think an abuse of the president's power to have that conversation, if it's true, but the president said he did today, with President Zelensky of Ukraine. Highly improper to send Rudy Giuliani to try to force the Ukrainians to investigate Vice President Biden and his son. We were talking earlier, the problem is, if now the Democrats want to bring this to impeachment proceedings, none of us know what this whistleblower said. None of us know what's in the summary, and it's going to be a summary, a written summary of the president's conversation, because since, as Senator Corker said, since the Nixon administration, we don't tape presidential phone calls or presidential meetings. Young people, when I was a young NSC staffer, we would do summaries of the president's recordings, but probably not verbatim. And so we might just be at a real impasse until the election of November 2020, until this can all be resolved, probably at the ballot box. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably the best way for us to do it.
Other questions? There we go, right in the back.
I'll speak loudly. I spent years doing business in China and Hong Kong, pre and post handover, and I was surprised and impressed that the Hong Kong people have stood up for themselves, and I wanted to know your thoughts on this and the ramifications for China.
I think it's remarkable, and I think every elected official in Washington ought to be supporting their efforts far more strongly than is taking place today. Because, when I was in the Senate, people used to say, well, your voice matters. And in a way, I took offense at that because what mattered to me was what we were doing, what we were getting done, what we were making happen for our country. Now that I've been gone for 9 months, I think I realize more than ever how powerful our voice is. And I can tell you, around the world, we think some proclamation of support, for instance, for the people of Hong Kong, or the president standing behind them, we think, well, but those are just words. Because we are the greatest nation on earth, and because we are who we are, you wouldn't believe how much impact that has on people and how much that spurs them on. It did in Ukraine. When we all were behind what we were doing there, it certainly would be the same case here. So it's remarkable what is happening there. My sense is probably some pro-China forces inside the groups probably are the ones that are creating the violence. I don't know that. That's the way things work when we have situations like this. To me, they've handled themselves very well, and I hope we will support them in major ways to make sure that stays a democracy. If it falls over time, Taiwan falls, whole new ball game in that part of the world.
I think it's really important that we express our support for the people who are demonstrating in Hong Kong. But I think we also have to be careful that we don't imply that we're prepared to use force to help defend their freedoms. This is something that the Chinese would never tolerate. It's the same thing in Taiwan. That's a red line for the Chinese. if we start to give them offensive weapons, if we say we're pro-democracy in Taiwan, then I think we're going to face a China that says, you crossed our red lines, and we're prepared to take action. So I think on the one hand, we have to voice our support for those who are demonstrating for openness, democracy, all that was pledged to them with the turnover a few years ago. They were pledged 50 years that they would have democracy prevail as it has. Well, the Chinese have violated that. They violated the promise to the president, our president, when they said they would not militarize those artificial edifices that they have created in the South China Sea, but they have militarized them. So there's been a breach of promise and a breach of promise for the Hong Kong Chinese. But I think we have to say we're prepared to support them vocally. We're prepared to support them in the event any action is taken against them economically and diplomatically. But I think we have to be careful we don't send the signal that we're with you all the way with our military as well. I think that would be problematic for us and for them.
I just say very briefly, to see the American flag being flown by the Hong Kong demonstrators, it does speak to the voice, the necessity to add our moral voice to help support them.
Yeah.
One more question, otherwise I don't see anyone here, and I think given our time, there's one other question I'd like each of you to, or one other set of thoughts I'd like for you to share with us. And we were talking earlier about there's so much to be discouraged about of what's going on in the world, what's going on in the United States. And can you just tell us something good? Let us be hopeful here as we wind up here of why there is a lot to be proud of and a lot to think about in terms of the future. Whoever wants to start.
I'm out of office now. I'm back in my hometown, and I'm giving a talk to about 450 people who are coming to our community in a couple of weeks on a particular topic. And I just have to say that the people of our country, I see them back home, things that are happening in cities across America, not all cities, but in many cities across America where they're taking on the issues that they need to deal with. People in this room are helping with that by dealing with the built environment. I just say that I know that the people of our country are better than the leadership we have today, and things will right themselves. We go through these periods of time, but we are a nation of great people, and people who truly care about neighbors in most cases. We're going to survive. We have bright young people doing all kinds of things that y'all were discussing in earlier panels today that are changing this industry, but also changing our own economic abilities here. And I know we're going to be fine.
I agree with what Senator Corker has just said, and I'm going to yield in a moment to the closer, who gave us a very inspirational comment last evening. I spend a good deal of time traveling around the world, and one of the universities I speak at is Nankai University in Tianjin. And I give a speech to a crowd about this size every year, of very young, idealistic young Chinese students. And what is amazing to me is they still look to the United States as the gold standard. They want to be like us. They want to have the freedom that we have. They want to be able to do. One time I had a student stand up in the back of the room and he said, "How were you able to do all the things that you have done?" And they went through my resume and my aspiration to be a professional basketball player and all of that. How were you able to do all of these things? And I said, because I live in a free country, and that people are not picked to do one thing with their lives by the government. You're able to do whatever your talents will carry you to. And I could see the lights go on in that young student and the students there. The notion that you have the freedom to be whatever your talent will take you to. And so we're still the inspiration for much of the world, and we have to keep that flame alive, and we keep it alive with the young people. Look who's testifying in the UN about climate change, who's testifying about gun control, but the young people of this country who say, we've got to get our country together again, stop hating each other, start building alliances with each other. You know, we're still fighting the Civil War. We're still fighting the Civil War, red state, blue state, conservative, liberal, socialist. The fact is that the world is turning so fast that we've got to really come together and look at each other and really see each other and understand that we all want the same thing in this life. And I think, as Senator Corker said, and Nick will say in a moment, there is no other country that has the freedom that we have. We're not monitored as they are in China. We are not required to pledge allegiance to a specific leader. We have a constitution, we have the rule of law, we've got young people coming up who believe in that. So I think we have every right to believe that it's going to be an optimistic future.
Boy,
Take
do I
us home,
agree.
Ambassador Burns.
I agree with these two statements. True story. A couple of years ago, I was asked to give a talk at my university, Harvard, about global trends. And my wife, Libby, made the huge mistake of attending. She had to listen to me. And so I gave a speech about all the problems and challenges in the world. And we were walking home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I said, how'd that go? And there was a pause. And she said, you're depressing everybody. I said, what do you mean? She said, and this was a real teachable moment for me. She said, I get that there are 1,000 challenges out there. What are you hopeful about? And why aren't you talking about hope? So that really impressed me. I always listen to her, of course. So I now poll my students at the end of every semester, and I teach classes of 60 and 70 students. A class of 75 last year had 21 nationalities. I send them an online poll. I say, tell me analytically, what are you hopeful about? Don't tell me what you wish for, but what are you hopeful about? Here's what I got back last semester. We're hopeful about the billion people who've been lifted out of poverty in the last 30 years in China and Nigeria and Brazil. Never happened before in human history. Number two, we're hopeful about the fact that...
The billion people.
The billion people.
Yeah,
Did I say million?
Yeah.
Billion with a B.
Yeah.
Lifted out of poverty, now above the global poverty line in the global middle class. That's an incredible achievement. Number two, global public health. Polio now exists in just 4 countries of the world. It's nearly eradicated. With a lot of effort, it can be eradicated in 3 to 5 years, and we have not eradicated a global disease since smallpox. Malaria killed 500,000 kids last year in sub-Saharan Africa beneath the age of 5. Bill Gates thinks a malaria vaccine, and Melinda Gates, can be developed and dispersed, and malaria can be eradicated. Number 3, the rise of women and gender equality. It's not perfect around the world. It's not even, but it's happening in some parts of the world. And I think maybe the biggest change I've seen since I arrived at Harvard is the opportunities that young women have that their mothers and grandmothers didn't. And number 4, technology. Young people are idealistic. They see technology as an unbridled good. They don't see maybe the double edge of technology, but they think they can cure cancer, the young millennial generation, and create a carbon-free environment. So these polls that I do every semester, I mean, it's been a really good experience for me to understand that you got to give people some hope. And I'd like to associate myself with Senator Corker and Secretary Cohen by saying, and it's what I meant to say last night, we're so lucky to be Americans. We have a great country, and we have so much to be proud of as we look forward, and we shouldn't be defeatist. And we shouldn't think that because we're in a dispiriting moment in our national history that we cannot be great. We are great. And that's where leadership comes in the House and Senate and in the White House.
I know we have a number of Republicans in the audience, and I can say that the only salvation you can go away with today is that if Joe Biden gets elected President of the United States, this will be your Secretary of State.
I almost had to say something after that. You'd be a very good one, by the way. I'm glad to hear it. I mean, I thought his speech last night was almost presidential, so anyway. This is kind of digressing, but to your point, there's a book that was written, I guess about a year ago, is it Factability by a Swedish doctor, that Bill Gates says had more impact on him than any book he's ever read, but it speaks to the stats. And it is amazing the numbers of people that have been lifted out of poverty around the world, the diseases that have been dealt with. There's no concern really anymore about population. I mean, we can deal with the population. Trends are changing. And so when you do get down, it's long, and there's a lot of data in there, and so it takes a while to absorb it all. But it's really amazing what, with our leadership and the values that we have spread around the world, which has driven all of this, it's amazing how much better the world is today than anyone would have expected 30 years ago. And we need to maintain the leadership, not just for our own people, although it is best for our own people that all these things are being dealt with, because it causes us also to have better lives. So it's an amazing thing that's happened in the world with our leadership. I want to thank DLA Piper for letting me be here and to actually learn from you. I know that I've contributed far less to you being here than you contributed to me this morning and hearing all these great panelists. So thank you as a minor real estate person compared to most of y'all. Thank you.
Thank you again to our.
I was going to do that. I didn't know you were on my list. I was going to thank them, but no, you should go out. I didn't realize you snuck up over on my side here. So, no, I just wanted to say the same as certainly you will do. A thank you for your thoughts and your candor. It really is a pleasure to listen to you, and you did, in fact, leave me at least with a little bit of hope in the end in this complicated world. So, with that, I thank you as well for sharing your thoughts with us today. And take it away, Paul.